the panel, how many people here are going, did you say?
It's a breakup. It's artists.
It's a combination of artists, arts professionals, community members from the area, and city staff from the funding department.
You have to be asked to be.
Yeah, actually. But we always kind of keep a running list of who's out there, and if, again, because we try and vary it, we will go out of our way to kind of call around to other spaces. I'll call Adriana, I'll call Matt, I'll call, I may call any of you at any point and say, who do you know? And it depends on the project, really, as to who, where the waiting is. If it's in a neighborhood, I'm looking at you, Joan, you're my example. Joan Waters in the back of the room finished a project for us that was in the Coronado neighborhood, and it was very much a neighborhood run process in the sense that they wanted the project, they drove the project, that's how the project was created, and so the arts professionals guided and were very much voting members of the panel, but ultimately the people in that neighborhood have to live with the artwork. So it kind of depends on the project as to who sways the panel the most.
Before you go, Rebecca, I don't know if most people know that they could sit in on some of these processes with your office.
They can. They're not open meetings. They are actually their job interviews, essentially. However, if there is a project that you're interested in the process, you can certainly call our office and speak with the project manager and sit in.
I actually was on the selection panel that chose out price for that first project, the drill bit bridge. Yeah, and I think we had done our first project for the city in 2004, and I sat on that in 2004, 2005. And it was really helpful to sit on a selection panel, but the funny thing is that everything I thought I understood from the selection panel hasn't really helped us. So I'm trying to forget everything, because we want that job so bad, but I'm just trying to forget all of that stuff and just get back to just doing whatever we want, like these filters and things. So I think it's a great thing to sit on those selection panels and get as much information as you can, but in the end, you just got to go which one.
I was wondering how presenting for this is different or similar to presenting for an architecture project. And also when you're starting out, how do you kind of time the number of images and how long you want to talk? Sometimes when you get up there, you sort of just lose everything. And how do you do that?
That's a good question. The second part of that question is a really good one. I tend to speak really fast, which is why Maria always puts me up to speak. I'm sort of the mouthpiece, but so I generally tend to go by a rule of thumb of 1 slide per minute, or no more than that. But it really depends. I have to go through and say, okay, well, these 10 slides, like the umbrella to the stone, I mean, those are really quick, obviously. But other ones that I would stop on, I don't know, I have to go through it and check it out. And then I'll practice and I'll time myself several times to make sure that I'm staying with the time before I go in and present. That was another thing we were going to talk about preparedness, just like what we did with Carl. We were pretending like Carl knew the project intimately, obviously, like he had done the project, put the proposal together, the PowerPoint proposal together, and then forgot about it for 2 days and then came up and presented. That was kind of the idea for how he was going to present that, and not really have practiced it. That is what you do not want to do. You want to practice. You want to make sure that you have your key ideas for every slide down. And that's the way that I set up the cartoon set as well, is that every single slide has an idea to it. And they all should be based around the same idea, so the same idea should come up again and again and again. Again, that's my way of telling the story. You may have a different way of doing it. But to me, it seems important that every single slide have a key idea to it, whatever that is. The other question that you had about what's different between preparing for an architectural project or presenting for an architectural project and art project, there's very little difference in a sense. We approach it really the same way. Whenever we present an architectural project, it's the same kind of thing where we talk about the story of what got us where we're at. And even if we're in the process, even if we're not at the final result, we still talk about that as a story of whatever concept and whatever we're doing, trying to bring that to a story just so that it makes a coherent line, from one side to another. I think the only difference is that we tend to, I think Maria and I tend to not embellish, but we tend to concentrate more on the conceptual side of things more when we talk about artwork rather than architecture, because for some reason people keep saying, hey, we don't want to live in a concept, show us the building, so that's kind of the only difference.
What's this, if you were chosen, how much does it change between hire it and what we would sit under?
Sometimes not at all, and that's the thing that's really amazing. We proposed for a project, we got shortlisted for a project in Glendale, and they said, we want you to come and propose, and you've got 2 weeks. And we said, okay, we sat down and we did this design, and then Maria and I just didn't like it, and we liked the concept, and so literally the day before we went in to present it, we came up with a different concept. We said, oh, we like this one, let's do this one. We walked in, presented it, they said, okay, that's great. And a week later, we had a contract that had the description of it and said, you have to do this contractually, you have to do this. So then we're like, well, we're trapped now. We can't even think about this anymore. So you got to be really careful about what you present. Sometimes it's, you have to do it. And that's good to know. I mean, that's why, another reason why you want to do exactly what you want to do. You don't want to go in thinking, giving them something that you think they want, but you don't want to do, and thinking you can talk them into something else, because sometimes that doesn't happen. On the other hand, one of the projects that we got for the city of Phoenix, we got selected. They said, everybody loved everything that you presented in the project, but you cannot do any of those elements that you showed at all. And we said, well, what do you mean? And they said, we had a project where it was a streetscape, and we had these big walls with hills in between them, so we were creating these artificial hills in the city of Phoenix where trees would be up about 10 feet off the ground starting and then going up. So there were these big artificial hills and everything, and they said, yeah, you can't do any of that. You can't have any curving walls. You can't have landscape up high because our landscape people might be handicapped and they can't get up there. And all of these different things. They said, we love your ideas. You won the ideas competition. You had the best ideas, but you can't do any of those ideas. So you have to start from scratch. And so that can happen too. Of course, we kept the same concepts as close as we could, but and we were ecstatic to have the job. So we were excited about going through the process again. I mean, to us too, anytime you have to relook at something, I'm sure you all go through this, it gets better the more times you work on it. So we never look at that as a bad thing. But you never know what's going to happen. And no two projects have ever been the same. I mean, ever. It's incredible.
And so now, how much of your, I guess, your time or your life is like your personal, your art?
Well, honestly, I would say about, now you have to understand, I didn't do studio art for 7 years before I started getting into public art, because that's when I was in architecture school. I went to college for 10 years. So I did 3 years of art and then 7 years of architecture school, essentially. And so I wasn't in the mode of studio art. And I'm still kind of in awe of people that do studio artwork, because I'm just not in that mode. To me, I got trained as an architect second. So to me, it's like, I want a project, I want a client, I want something I can, build from. And so, but I still do installation ideas. I just don't have the time to implement them. So I've got a list of all these projects that I'd like to see done in my studio, but I just haven't had time to do it. I'm too busy doing other stuff. So I would say 5% of my time is doing my own stuff, and 95% is doing work for municipalities, essentially. But the people that I know that, like Mary Lucky, who's a good friend of mine, who does public art and also studio art, I think her time is something like, probably 70-30, maybe 75-25. And I think it depends on how busy she is at the moment, and it really depends on where your heart is and what you want to do. Public art is a wonderful way to get your ideas out to as many people in the public as you can. It's a really wonderful way to do that. But like I said, it is a compromise. You do not get to do just anything you want. In the end, there has to be some compromise. For instance, in the studio, you imagine, let's say you try to imagine a white box and you can fill it with whatever you want. But when you have a real site, you have to really ground it to the earth. And kids are going to try and come up and hit it with a crowbar or a baseball bat or shoot a gun at it or whatever. You got to think about all those things. So somehow your project has to get compromised somewhat usually by some circumstance. And so for you, it's going to be a personal decision, I think, for everybody, it has to be how much do you want to work in that compromised environment? How much do you want to just work in your studio environment? I think it differs for everybody. I think for me, just because of my training, it's very little that I do studio art. I wish I did more. If I ran out of work, I would do more.
What about the idea of, and probably budget and economy are the big ideas here, but what about the idea of taking the experience you have in public art projects and what you know and working for private clients, so you're not under that public money thing?
I'm still waiting for that to happen.
I mean, as more and more people want sustainable and design becomes valued and understood, is that something you see happening? And
Maria and I were approached once to work for a private developer to produce artwork for a building where they didn't have the time to design the outside of the building, so they wanted us to do this big art project on the whole outside of the building. And unfortunately, that was in late 2007. He said, "Yeah, we're having problems with financing." I said, "Who are you getting your financing through?" And he said, "Lehman Brothers." And then 2 weeks later, we found out what happened. So that never happened, came to fruition. But he was also somebody that I knew. So he's the only person that's ever approached us from a private entity to do it. But it does happen. In fact, there's several times where they have public-private partnerships between corporations or developments that kind of work with BOAC. And you see, what we call plop art, some people call plop art in front of some of the buildings and things. Those are those opportunities. I hope that they start happening more with public artists, but it seems like it happens more in public too.
There are other programs, Scottsdale's public art program actually has an art and private development component to it. So far, the city of Phoenix does not. However, I will say that we've seen artists who've done public projects through our program, and then, they're approached by architects or developers after the fact. And, sometimes it develops into something else. We've had 2 artists now who told us that the terrazzo floor they designed or the fence they designed turned into something that a private corporation.
But I will say that they're not necessarily a better client either, because then you don't have a committee that you're dealing with, and there isn't as much of a public process that you've been through. So sometimes you get those private clients, and then they want to be much more constricting, from what I've been told. So.
you don't have a project manager to help.
You may or may not, but they are looking out for
Guide
corporate
you.
interests, so they may or may not be interested in